In 1912, on the day the Titanic left England, a remarkable man of advanced age arrived in North America from the East. Born in Persia, exiled in his youth, and imprisoned for 40 years for his beliefs, he came bearing a message of universal peace, and from April 11th to December 5th, 1912, he gave over 400 talks to a combined audience of an estimated 93,000 people. As he traveled across the nation from coast to coast, he astonished those he met with his extraordinary knowledge and perceptions. He spoke on race unity, gender equality, and social justice. His followers considered him a perfect exemplar of the faith he represented. They called him the Master and the Mystery of God. The merest glimpse of his majestic presence and sagacity is all that can be conveyed in any record of his luminous journey to these shores. (1912) in America. A land of optimism and vitality. Immigrants flocked to its welcoming shores in search of a better life. The United States was still expanding, with stars for new states, Arizona and New Mexico, added to its flag. People everywhere were dancing American dances, listening to American music, and wearing American fashions. The first eastbound transcontinental flight was made. Columbia University established the Pulitzer Prize for Journalists. Universal Pictures became incorporated as the nation's first movie studio. Oliver Twist became America's first feature-length film. A woman named Juliette Gordon Low made news when she founded the organization that became known as the Girl Scouts of America. The 5th Olympic Summer Games were held in Sweden, with Americans winning the most gold medals. The Boston Red Sox defeated New York during the World Series of 1912. Some of the games took place in Fenway Park, which opened earlier that year. 3,000 cherry trees were given by Japan to Washington, D.C. to symbolize optimism and friendship. But there were problems as well. Undernourished and unhealthy, children worked long hours in mills and mines. Racial laws and segregation reflected deeply embedded prejudice. Women could not yet vote, a controversial issue. Labor unions arose in response to increasing poverty and the growing gap between rich and poor. It was an election year. Politics had become almost unthinkably divisive, fragmenting the Republican Party and leading to the election of a Democratic president. Religion in America was increasingly diverse, reflecting the beliefs of waves of new immigrants. Conservative Protestants vehemently disagreed on points of doctrine, while liberal thinkers explored alternative beliefs including the appealing philosophies of Hindu and Buddhist sages, such as Swami Vivekananda and Dharmapala. Abdu'l-Bahá entered this compelling scene as the leader of an emerging independent religion. Born in Persia in 1844, he was given the name Abbas Effendi, yet preferred to be known as Abdu'l-Bahá, servant of glory. He was the son of Baha'u'llah, the revealer of a new universal religion, the Baha'i faith. Abdu'l-Bahá was the first to recognize the spiritual station of his father, and thus the first Baha'i. In 1892, Baha'u'llah passed away. It was in his will and testament that Baha'u'llah appointed Abdu'l-Bahá as his successor. He called Abdu'l-Bahá the center of his covenant. This covenant with his followers was to assure that power struggles would not mar the goal of unity among the believers. It would safeguard the Baha'i faith from splitting into divisions. After 40 years of confinement in the prison city of Akka, he was liberated in 1908 by the Young Turk Revolution. Despite the exile and imprisonment of its leaders, the Baha'i faith had already spread to the West. American Baha'is, such as the philanthropist Phoebe Hearst, made the arduous journey to the Holy Land to see him. Others waited eagerly for his visit to America. News of his freedom prompted followers around the world to urge him to visit their countries. Americans invited him to sail to their shores aboard the new luxury liner, the Titanic. Abdu'l-Bahá returned the money offered for his trip and chose to board the more modest ship, the SS Cedric, which sailed from Egypt on March 25th.
(1853) in Persia. A land of rich cultural heritage and religious persecution. A new faith has emerged. It promises the coming of a divine educator to bring about a new dawn of civilization.
Southern people whose hearts were once filled with the most bitter prejudices have publicly acknowledged their change of heart.
On April 28th, Abdu'l-Bahá left by train for Chicago. Like many other cities, Chicago was bitterly divided over racial issues. At Hull House, a settlement house for immigrants founded by Jane Addams, vice president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association and chairman of the Women's Peace Party, Abdu'l-Bahá addressed the issue of color to an overflow audience.
Shall this, the least of all distinctions, separate you as races and individuals? The various races of humankind lend a composite harmony and beauty of color to the whole. Let all associate, therefore, in this great human garden, even as flowers grow and blend together side by side.
After Abdu'l-Bahá's address, many immigrant children and unemployed men gathered around, and to each he gave some coins. From Hull House, he went to the 4th Annual Convention of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which earlier had been discussing lynchings and job discrimination. He asked the gathering,
"Can we say that man of a certain hue, white, black, brown, yellow, red, is the true image of his Creator? we must conclude that color is of no importance. Man is not man simply because of bodily attributes. The standard of divine measure is his intelligence and spirit.
W.E.B. Du Bois, editor of the NAACP journal The Crisis, and one of the most influential African Americans in the country, published an account that noted,
1,000 disappointed people were unable to get in the hall to experience the calm, sweet universalism of Abdu'l-Bahá.
Du Bois featured Abdu'l-Bahá as Man of the Month in his journal, and a digest of Abdu'l-Bahá's Hull House and NAACP talks.
Southern people whose hearts were once filled with the most bitter prejudices have publicly acknowledged their change of heart.
On April 28th, Abdu'l-Bahá left by train for Chicago. Like many other cities, Chicago was bitterly divided over racial issues. At Hull House, a settlement house for immigrants founded by Jane Addams, vice president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association and chairman of the Women's Peace Party, Abdu'l-Bahá addressed the issue of color to an overflow audience.
Shall this, the least of all distinctions, separate you as races and individuals? The various races of humankind lend a composite harmony and beauty of color to the whole. Let all associate, therefore, in this great human garden, even as flowers grow and blend together side by side.
After Abdu'l-Bahá's address, many immigrant children and unemployed men gathered around, and to each he gave some coins. From Hull House, he went to the 4th annual convention of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which earlier had been discussing lynchings and job discrimination. He asked the gathering,
Can we say that man of a certain hue, white, black, brown, yellow, red, is the true image of his creator? We must conclude that color is of no importance. Man is not man simply because of bodily attributes. The standard of divine measure is his intelligence and spirit.
W.E.B. Du Bois, editor of the NAACP journal The Crisis, and one of the most influential African Americans in the country, published an account that noted,
1,000 disappointed people were unable to get in the hall to experience the calm, sweet universalism of Abdu'l-Bahá.
Du Bois featured Abdu'l-Bahá as Man of the Month in his journal, and a digest of Abdu'l-Bahá's Hull House and NAACP talks. Race unity continued as a theme throughout Abdu'l-Bahá's journey, and his talks attracted numerous African Americans to the Baha'i faith. Among them were Elaine Locke, a preeminent black scholar and a founder of the Harlem Renaissance; Ida B. Wells, a leading activist in Chicago; and Robert Abbott, publisher of the Chicago Defender. Abdu'l-Bahá also stressed gender equality in Chicago. He spoke to the Federation of Women's Clubs at the Hotel La Salle. One woman had been at the heart of the acquisition of the temple grounds. In 1907, Corinne True took to the Holy Land, for Abdu'l-Bahá's approval, a petition bearing signatures of Baha'is in America wishing to build a temple. He stunned the all-male Chicago Baha'i Governing Council when he directed them to confer with Corinne about his instructions for the temple, and specified that women should be on the temple committee. Corinne had suffered many difficulties, including the deaths of her husband, 3 sons, and a daughter. When Abdu'l-Bahá arrived in Chicago, her only surviving son, Davis, was critically ill. Abdu'l-Bahá went to the True home to see Davis, who died later that day. Despite her grief, Corinne went to the temple site the next day. On May 1st, a blustery day in Wilmette, Abdu'l-Bahá dedicated the grounds for the first Western Baha'i house of worship. 300 people filled the seats and another 200 stood on the outside edge. Abdu'l-Bahá walked the grounds before entering. The prepared program cast aside, he addressed the eager listeners.
Thousands of Masrik al-Askar's dawning points of praise of God for all will be built in the east and in the west, but this, being the first one erected in the Occident, has great importance.
Years earlier, a poor seamstress, Nettie Tobin, had procured a rejected construction site stone. A newsboy helped her drag it onto the temple property. Upon seeing it among the weeds, Abdu'l-Bahá declared that it represented the sacrifice of the believers and sent some boys to recover it. Shovels were borrowed from a nearby construction site. Then Corinne True suggested,
"Perhaps a woman should be allowed to turn a shovel of earth on this momentous day."
Lua Getzinger, an eloquent teacher of the Baha'i faith, was called forward by Abdu'l-Bahá to take a turn. The oneness of humanity was displayed when several women from east and west turned the sod in preparation for the stone. Abdu'l-Bahá presented handfuls of earth to various people as souvenirs. On behalf of all people, he rolled the stone into the hole, pushed dirt around it with the trowel, and pounded it down with the shovel. As he put the spade into the earth, he declared,
"The temple is already built."
The dedication ceremony proved to be one of the signal events of Abdu'l-Bahā's ministry and a defining moment in the creation of a unified Baha'i community beginning to emerge in North America. Since 1933, when the first tours of the site were offered, the Baha'i Temple and its grounds have been open to all for worship and reflection. The gardens and building continue to be embellished and beautified. The day after the temple dedication, the True family held a funeral for Corinne's son, Davis. Later, Abdu'l-Bahá went to the cemetery and prayed for Davis and for all the people buried there. At Northwestern University, Abdu'l-Bahá spoke to the Theosophists at University Hall on eternal life and death as merely a transformation. On May 5th, he spoke at the Plymouth Congregational Church. After Reverend Joseph Milburn introduced him, the audience stood and burst into cheers that stopped only when he motioned them to silence. That evening, he spoke at the All Souls Church, held at the Abraham Lincoln Center. Mahmoud noted that people surrounded him like moths. Abdu'l-Bahá spent time walking and meeting people in Lincoln Park, directly across from his hotel. He went to the park's zoo, as he'd never been to a large zoo. And he was happy to see the various animals. One day, he was with a group under a grove of trees near the park's lake, and he said,
"Some of you may have observed that I have not called attention to any of your individual shortcomings. I would suggest to you that if you shall be similarly considerate in your treatment of each other, it will be greatly conducive to the harmony of your association with each other."
Abdu'l-Bahá met with 35 children and their parents at the Plaza Hotel. After hearing them sing, he called the children to him individually, asking for their names. Afterwards, Abdu'l-Bahá gave each child an envelope full of rose petals and invited them all to Lincoln Park for a photograph. He then asked for time alone and walked over to a statue of Abraham Lincoln, at which he gazed for a while. In Chicago, he revealed a special prayer for America.
O thou kind Lord, this gathering is turning to Thee. These hearts are radiant with Thy love. These minds and spirits are exhilarated by the message of Thy glad tidings. O God, let this American democracy become glorious in spiritual degrees, even as it has aspired to material degrees, and render this just government victorious. Confirm this revered nation to upraise the standard of the oneness of humanity, to promulgate the most great peace, to become thereby most glorious and praiseworthy among all the nations of the world. O God, this American nation is worthy of Thy favors and is deserving of Thy mercy. Make it precious and near to Thee, through Thy bounty and bestowal.
On May 6th, Abdu'l-Bahá's marathon journey continued by train through Toledo to Cleveland, where he stayed one night. There he talked about America's destiny to a gathering of 40 at the home of Dr. Charles Swingle. That evening, he addressed some 500 people at the Hotel Euclid, offering a plea that America become the champion of world peace.
It is my hope that this just government will stand for peace, so that warfare may be abolished throughout the world, and the standards of national unity and reconciliation be upraised. This American nation is equipped and empowered to accomplish that which will adorn the pages of history, to become the envy of the world, and to be blessed in the East and the West. I pray that this may come to pass.
He met with reporters who wanted to know his stance on the relationship between blacks and whites. His support of interracial marriage made headlines. His visit resulted in at least 8 local articles. In Pittsburgh, where Abdu'l-Bahá spent one night, Martha Root, an accomplished newswoman, arranged for him to talk to 400 people at the Hotel Shenley. He also had private meetings with leaders of thought. 5 local newspaper articles resulted. In New Jersey on May 11th, he spoke to 800 at the Montclair Unity Church. And then to 2,000 more at the International Peace Forum at Grace Methodist Episcopal Church in New York. The next day, he was guest of honor at the New York Peace Society. Anna Garland Spencer, a suffrage and peace leader and ordained minister, introduced Abdu'l-Bahá as the prophet of the East and the messenger of peace. Others spoke about him, including the Consul General of Persia, Hossein Johannes Topakyan, who referred to Abdu'l-Bahá as a prophet of enlightenment and peace for the Persian Empire and the glory of Persia. Then the Society's president and a co-founder of the NAACP, Dr. Stephen S. Weiss, welcomed him warmly. Mahmoud comments,
"The master stood, and a great excitement rippled through the audience. He delivered an incomparable speech. The audience was deeply moved."
The next day, Abdu'l-Bahá traveled to Lake Mohonk to address the International Peace Society's 1912 conference on international arbitration at the invitation of Albert Smiley, a Quaker and visionary founder of the Mohonk Mountain House and the arbitration conferences, for which he was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize in 1911. A small party, including Lua and Edward Getzinger and Montford Mills, a New York lawyer, traveled in a horse-drawn carriage with Abdu'l-Bahá. who was so exhilarated by the beauty of nature that he burst into songs of joy, asking others to sing. At the conference that evening, he proclaimed that religion would be a cause of unity in the world if aided by the breath of the Holy Spirit. He stressed that religion and science were twins and couldn't disagree if the facts of both were known. Reverend Frederick Lynch at the Metropolitan Temple in New York later called Abdu'l-Bahá's address at Mohonk
the most remarkable address I have ever listened to, full of this one thing, unity. When you get beneath different languages, nationalities, races, colors, temperaments, after all, we are one.
On the eve of departure, Abdu'l-Bahá wanted to return Albert Smiley's kindness with a gift of a Persian rug. Zia Baghdadi of his entourage immediately took a freight train to the city, awoke the people in Abdu'l-Bahá's apartment at 2 a.m. to retrieve a rug, and caught the first train back to Lake Mohonk. There he begged the mailman to give him a ride to the resort on the morning mail wagon, arriving at 10 a.m. just as Abdu'l-Bahá was shaking Smiley's hand. Smiley responded,
"Why, this is just what I have been seeking for many years. We had a Persian rug just like this one, but it was burned in a fire and my wife has been broken-hearted. This will make her very happy."
Abdu'l-Bahá continued an exhausting schedule of meetings and presentations on the East Coast. In Boston, delegates from many organizations gathered at the railway station to greet him on May 22nd. He stayed at the Hotel Charlesgate. At the American Unitarian Association conference at the Tremont Temple Baptist Church, on April 20th, Abdu'l-Bahá traveled to Washington, D.C. Newspaper columnist Elbert Hubbard reported,
"A very great man has recently visited America. Out of Persia comes Abdu'l-Bahá, who calls himself the servant of God. This man is the modern Messiah. He meets all classes and kinds of people. Let him visit any bank, factory, office building, church, and everything is laid aside, and eyes bulge and ears listen until he takes his departure."
Agnes Parsons, the daughter of a military officer who had fought under General Custer, married into wealth and with a circle of prominent friends, had made a pilgrimage to Akka in 1910. She created a Georgian-style home with a room that could hold 150 people. During his first visit to Washington, he stayed in her home, and on subsequent visits, he held meetings there regularly. She introduced Abdu'l-Bahá to politicians, artists, writers, and professors in large and small gatherings around the city. On April 26th, he entertained numerous visitors, including the U.S. Treasurer Lee McClung, who later recalled,
"I felt as if I were in the presence of a great prophet. Isaiah, Elijah. No, that's not it. The presence of Christ. No. I felt as if I were in the presence of my divine Father."
He addressed capacity crowds at President Taft's All Saints Unitarian Church and the prestigious Continental Hall of the Daughters of the American Revolution, sharing the platform with reformers like Samuel Gompers and DAR President Julia Green Scott. Before an audience of 3,000, including young suffragette women, he spoke on the importance of women's rights and received a standing ovation.
One of the teachings of Baha'u'llah is equality of rights for men and women. When he promulgated this principle in the Orient, the people were astonished. One of the proofs of the advancement of women is this magnificent building and this large gathering.
When he spoke of the necessity of giving women the same training as men, applause was thunderous. One newspaper had reported,
Abdu'l-Bahá, leader of the Baha'i movement, in his last public address in this city, last night at the Memorial Continental Hall, made a plea for the equality of man and woman.
He thoroughly enjoyed the sights of the Capitol, touring the statuary and paintings of the Capitol building, and enjoying the view from the top of the Washington Monument. One night he toured Washington's most ornately embellished edifice, the Library of Congress, with Mr. and Mrs. Parsons. They rode the elevator to look down at the reading room, and he examined bronze busts around the rotunda. The library superintendent appeared and ordered the lights left on until Abdu'l-Bahá finished his tour. Despite a relentless schedule, Abdu'l-Bahá made time to go with Agnes Parsons to the Arlington National Cemetery to chant a prayer and place roses at her parents' grave. Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone, was captivated by Abdu'l-Bahá and invited him to address the scientific society he served as president, where members shared their discoveries. Abdu'l-Bahá spoke of the importance of science. Mahmoud notes,
The hearts of those present were so moved that when the next member arose to give his talk, he could only say, "The talk of the master from the East was so wonderful that I find myself inadequate to say anything," and sat down.
Agnes Parsons arranged for the prominent English sculptor Theodore Spicer Simpson to sketch his likeness for a medallion.
Alexander Graham Bell's celebrated Wednesday evening was one of the intellectual high spots in Washington at this time. At one of those Wednesdays, I met Abdu'l-Bahá. Later, Mrs. Agnes Parsons asked me to do a portrait medallion of him. But would he sit? Mrs. Parsons asked a number of her friends to her Washington home to greet the prophet. After the introductions, he took hold of my hand and led me to a sofa, where for a time we talked of aesthetics, particularly Persian art, for which I had a great admiration. Mrs. Parsons was convinced he would be willing to sit, and he was.
A second medallion was later designed by another well-known artist, Louis Potter. Although there are some discrepancies in the historical record, Mahmoud reports that former President Theodore Roosevelt came to see Abdu'l-Bahá at Agnes Parsons' home, and they had a wonderful visit. An article published in the New York Tribune on January 20th, 1912, reveals that Roosevelt knew about him before his visit.
He pronounced himself as wonderfully impressed with the teaching of Abdu'l-Bahá, the Persian teacher of a universal religion expected in this country in May.
The influential artist and thespian Alice Pike Barney entertained society people and diplomats with her tableaux, interpretive dances, and musicals. One could say in her day she was the art scene of Washington, D.C. Alice had met Abdu'l-Bahá when she accompanied her daughter Laura to Akka in 1905. Laura Barney would become known for her work translating Abdu'l-Bahā's talks from notes she had written on pilgrimage. They would be published as Some Answered Questions. When Abdu'l-Bahá came to Washington, Alice hosted a luncheon and 2 evening receptions at her studio. One reporter wrote,
All yesterday afternoon, women in automobiles and carriages arrived for private conversations with the aged leader. Mrs. Nicholas Longworth, former President Roosevelt's daughter, seemed greatly interested.
Ali Quli Khan, one of Abdu'l-Bahā's secretaries in Akka, came to Washington, D.C. in 1901 to work for the Persian minister. In 1910, he was appointed Iran's chargé d'affaires. He was able to host receptions for Abdu'l-Bahá and invite prominent diplomats to meet him. He obtained invitations for Abdu'l-Bahá to visit the White House and to speak to the United States Congress, but scheduling did not work out. Khan's marriage to Florence Breed of Boston was the first Persian-American marriage among Baha'is and a symbol of East-West unity. Abdu'l-Bahá was photographed with the Khan children. one of the numerous occasions in which he focused his attention on children. The Turkish ambassador, Dia Pasha, hosted a dinner for Abdu'l-Bahá. He emphasized the unity between the East and West. When Abdu'l-Bahá spoke at the Orient-Occident Unity Conference in Washington's Public Library, Mahmoud observed,
"The hall was filled. As the master entered, the audience was awestruck. All stood and remained standing until he bade them be seated."
At the end of his talk, he said,
May this American democracy be the first nation to establish a foundation of international agreement, to proclaim the universality of mankind, to upraise the standard of the most great peace. Truly, this is a great and revered nation. Here, liberty has reached its highest degree. The intentions of its people are most praiseworthy. I will supplicate God for assistance in your behalf.
One reception for Abdu'l-Bahá included Admiral Robert Perry, Mabel Thorpe Boardman, head of the American Red Cross, and Alexander Graham Bell. Admiral Perry was still being celebrated for his greatest feat, his 1909 expedition to reach the North Pole. Juliet Thompson remarked,
"That day he looked like a blown-up balloon. Abdu'l-Bahá spoke charmingly to him and congratulated him for his discovery, and then thanked him for discovering that nothing was to be found there, and so in relieving the public mind, he had rendered a great service." I shall never forget Perry's face. The balloon collapsed.
Louis G. Gregory, an African-American lawyer and descendant of slaves, became a Baha'i in Washington in 1909. Abdu'l-Bahá encouraged him to
become the means whereby the white and colored people close their eyes to racial differences and behold the reality of humanity.
Gregory facilitated integrated meetings, though some opposed. In 1911, he went on pilgrimage to Akka, and Abdu'l-Bahá encouraged him to confront racial divisions with love and patience. In Washington, D.C., Gregory arranged for him to speak at African-American venues. He addressed the Bethel Literary and Historical Society at the Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church to a large mixed-race audience. At Rankin Chapel of Howard University, America's premier black university, Abdu'l-Bahá proclaimed to over 1,600 faculty and students how the oneness of humanity transcends race.
Today I am most happy, for I see here a gathering of the servants of God. I see white and black sitting together. There are no whites and blacks before God. Strive jointly to make extraordinary progress and mix together completely.
He gave the diverse audience a new vision concerning the possibilities for unity and the advancement for people of color. Abdu'l-Bahá then went to the Persian legation for a luncheon with some people prominent in the social and political life of Washington. Beforehand, Abdu'l-Bahá asked Louis Gregory to meet with him at the legation, prolonging their talk until luncheon was announced. Washington was a thoroughly segregated city, where African Americans and whites did not dine together. When Abdu'l-Bahá led the guests to the dining room, Gregory stayed behind, planning to slip away quietly. Abdu'l-Bahá arranged the place of honor at his right for the African-American lawyer, and then Khan hurried off to retrieve Gregory before he left the building. Once everyone had been seated, Abdu'l-Bahá rose, stated he was very pleased to have Mr. Gregory there, and then, as if nothing unusual had happened, spoke on the oneness of humankind. Gregory himself later wrote that
Abdu'l-Bahá made everyone feel perfectly at ease by his genial humor, wisdom, and outpouring of love.
Accompanying Abdu'l-Bahá in his travels was British Baha'i Louisa Matthew. She and Louis Gregory had become friends while on pilgrimage the previous year. Louisa tells how Abdu'l-Bahá gave her a white flower and told her to give it to Louis Gregory.
By looking at me in a peculiar way, He conveyed his meaning to me that he wished me to marry Mr. Gregory.
The Gregorys married and shared many years together. Washington Baha'i Pauline Hannon, though first shy with Black Americans, taught her washerwoman the faith. Then bravely, she and Joseph, her husband, held integrated meetings and became proponents of racial integration. At an interracial gathering at Joseph and Pauline Hannon's, he expressed joy at seeing the races together.
It is evident that excellence does not depend upon color. Character is the true criterion of humanity.
The Chicago Defender, the most influential African-American paper in the United States, printed a glowing report of Abdu'l-Bahá's impact on the integration of the Washington Baha'i community.
His visit to Washington has been a triumphal march. He was the guest of one of Washington's wealthiest women, one who moves in the most exclusive social circles at the Capitol. And yet her house has been thrown open to rich and poor and black and white. Southern people whose hearts were once filled with the most bitter prejudices have publicly acknowledged their change of heart.
On April 28th, Abdu'l-Bahá left by train for Chicago. Like many other cities, Chicago was bitterly divided over racial issues. At Hull House, a settlement house for immigrants founded by Jane Addams, vice president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association and chairman of the Women's Peace Party, Abdu'l-Bahá addressed the issue of color to an overflow audience.
Shall this, the least of all distinctions, separate you as races and individuals? The various races of humankind lend a composite harmony and beauty of color to the whole. Let all associate, therefore, in this great human garden, even as flowers grow and blend together side by side.
After Abdu'l-Bahá's address, many immigrant children and unemployed men gathered around, and to each he gave some coins. From Hull House, he went to the 4th Annual Convention of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which earlier had been discussing lynchings and job discrimination. He asked the gathering,
"Can we say that man of a certain hue, white, black, brown, yellow, red, is the true image of his creator? We must conclude that color is of no importance. Man is not man simply because of bodily attributes. The standard of divine measure is his intelligence and spirit."
W.E.B. Du Bois, editor of the NAACP journal The Crisis, and one of the most influential African Americans in the country, published an account that noted,
1,000 disappointed people were unable to get in the hall to experience the calm, sweet universalism of Abdu'l-Bahá.
Du Bois featured Abdu'l-Bahá as Man of the Month in his journal, and a digest of Abdu'l-Bahá's Hull House and NAACP talks. Race unity continued as a theme throughout Abdu'l-Bahá's journey, and his talks attracted numerous African Americans to the Baha'i faith. Among them were Elaine Locke, a preeminent black scholar and a founder of the Harlem Renaissance; Ida B. Wells, a leading activist in Chicago; and Robert Abbott, publisher of the Chicago Defender. Abdu'l-Bahá also stressed gender equality in Chicago. He spoke to the Federation of Women's Clubs at the Hotel La Salle. One woman had been at the heart of the acquisition of the temple grounds. In 1907, Corinne True took to the Holy Land for Abdu'l-Bahá's approval a petition bearing signatures of Baha'is in America wishing to build a temple. He stunned the all-male Chicago Baha'i Governing Council when he directed them to confer with Corinne about his instructions for the temple and specified that women should be on the temple committee. Corinne had suffered many difficulties, including the deaths of her husband, 3 sons, and a daughter. When Abdu'l-Bahá arrived in Chicago, her only surviving son, Davis, was critically ill. Abdu'l-Bahá went to the true home to see Davis, who died later that day. Despite her grief, Corinne went to the temple site the next day. On May 1st, a blustery day in Wilmette, Abdu'l-Bahá dedicated the grounds for the first Western Baha'i house of worship. 300 people filled the seats and another 200 stood on the outside edge. Abdu'l-Bahá walked the grounds before entering. The prepared program cast aside, he addressed the eager listeners.
Thousands of Masriq al-Asghars, dawning points of praise of God for all, will be built in the east and in the west. But this, being the first one erected in the Occident, has great importance.
Years earlier, a poor seamstress, Nettie Tobin, had procured a rejected construction site stone. A newsboy helped her drag it onto the temple property. Upon seeing it among the weeds, Abdu'l-Bahá declared that it represented the sacrifice of the believers and sent some boys to recover it. Shovels were borrowed from a nearby construction site. Then Corinne True suggested,
perhaps a woman should be allowed to turn a shovel of earth on this momentous day.
Lua Getzinger, an eloquent teacher of the Baha'i faith, was called forward by Abdu'l-Bahá to take a turn. The oneness of humanity was displayed when several women from east and west turned the sod in preparation for the stone. Abdu'l-Bahá presented handfuls of earth to various people as souvenirs. On behalf of all people, he rolled the stone into the hole, pushed dirt around it with the trowel, and pounded it down with the shovel. As he put the spade into the earth, he declared,
"The temple is already built."
The dedication ceremony proved to be one of the signal events of Abdu'l-Bahā's ministry and a defining moment in the creation of a unified Baha'i community beginning to emerge in North America. Since 1933, when the first tours of the site were offered, the Baha'i Temple and its grounds have been open to all for worship and reflection. The gardens and building continue to be embellished and beautified. The day after the temple dedication, the True family held a funeral for Corinne's son Davis. Later, Abdu'l-Bahá went to the cemetery and prayed for Davis and for all the people buried there. At Northwestern University, Abdu'l-Bahá spoke to the Theosophists at University Hall on eternal life and death as merely a transformation. On May 5th, he spoke at the Plymouth Congregational Church. After Reverend Joseph Milburn introduced him, the audience stood and burst into cheers that stopped only when he motioned them to silence. That evening, he spoke at the All Souls Church, held at the Abraham Lincoln Center. Mahmoud noted that people surrounded him like moths. Abdu'l-Bahá spent time walking and meeting people in Lincoln Park, directly across from his hotel. He went to the park's zoo, as he'd never been to a large zoo. And he was happy to see the various animals. One day, he was with a group under a grove of trees near the park's lake, and he said,
"Some of you may have observed that I have not called attention to any of your individual shortcomings. I would suggest to you that if you shall be similarly considerate in your treatment of each other, it will be greatly conducive to the harmony of your association with each other."
Abdu'l-Bahá met with 35 children and their parents at the Plaza Hotel. After hearing them sing, he called the children to him individually, asking for their names. Afterwards, Abdu'l-Bahá gave each child an envelope full of rose petals and invited them all to Lincoln Park for a photograph. He then asked for time alone and walked over to a statue of Abraham Lincoln, at which he gazed for a while. In Chicago, he revealed a special prayer for America.
O thou kind Lord, this gathering is turning to Thee. These hearts are radiant with Thy love. These minds and spirits are exhilarated by the message of Thy glad tidings. O God, let this American democracy become glorious in spiritual degrees, even as it has aspired to material degrees, and render this just government victorious. Confirm this revered nation to upraise the standard of the oneness of humanity, to promulgate the most great peace, to become thereby most glorious and praiseworthy among all the nations of the world. O God, this American nation is worthy of Thy favors and is deserving of Thy mercy. Make it precious and near to Thee, through Thy bounty and bestowal.
On May 6th, Abdu'l-Bahá's marathon journey continued by train through Toledo to Cleveland, where he stayed one night. There, he talked about America's destiny to a gathering of 40 at the home of Dr. Charles Swingle. That evening, he addressed some 500 people at the Hotel Euclid, offering a plea that America become the champion of world peace.
It is my hope that this just government will stand for peace, so that warfare may be abolished throughout the world, and the standards of national unity and reconciliation be upraised. This American nation is equipped and empowered to accomplish that which will adorn the pages of history, to become the envy of the world, and to be blessed in the East and the West. I pray that this may come to pass.
He met with reporters who wanted to know his stance on the relationship between blacks and whites. His support of interracial marriage made headlines. His visit resulted in at least 8 local articles. In Pittsburgh, where Abdu'l-Bahá spent one night, Martha Root, an accomplished newswoman, arranged for him to talk to 400 people at the Hotel Shenley. He also had private meetings with leaders of thought. 5 local newspaper articles resulted. In New Jersey on May 11th, he spoke to 800 at the Montclair Unity Church. And then to 2,000 more at the International Peace Forum at Grace Methodist Episcopal Church in New York. The next day, he was guest of honor at the New York Peace Society. Anna Garland Spencer, a suffrage and peace leader and ordained minister, introduced Abdu'l-Bahá as the prophet of the East and the messenger of peace. Others spoke about him, including the Consul General of Persia, Hossein Johannes Topakyan, who referred to Abdu'l-Bahá as a prophet of enlightenment and peace for the Persian Empire and the glory of Persia. Then the Society's president and a co-founder of the NAACP, Dr. Stephen S. Weiss, welcomed him warmly. Mahmoud comments,
"The master stood, and a great excitement rippled through the audience. he delivered an incomparable speech. The audience was deeply moved.
The next day, Abdu'l-Bahá traveled to Lake Mohonk to address the International Peace Society's 1912 conference on international arbitration at the invitation of Albert Smiley, a Quaker and visionary founder of the Mohonk Mountain House and the arbitration conferences, for which he was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize in 1911. A small party, including Lua and Edward Getzinger and Montford Mills, a New York lawyer, traveled in a horse-drawn carriage with Abdu'l-Bahá. Who was so exhilarated by the beauty of nature that he burst into songs of joy, asking others to sing. At the conference that evening, he proclaimed that religion would be a cause of unity in the world if aided by the breath of the Holy Spirit. He stressed that religion and science were twins and couldn't disagree if the facts of both were known. Reverend Frederick Lynch at the Metropolitan Temple in New York later called Abdu'l-Bahá's address at Mohonk
the most remarkable address I have ever listened to, full of this one thing, unity. When you get beneath different languages, nationalities, races, colors, temperaments, after all, we are one.
On the eve of departure, Abdu'l-Bahá wanted to return Albert Smiley's kindness with a gift of a Persian rug. Zia Baghdadi of his entourage immediately took a freight train to the city, awoke the people in Abdu'l-Bahá's apartment at 2 a.m. to retrieve a rug, and caught the first train back to Lake Mohonk. There he begged the mailman to give him a ride to the resort on the morning mail wagon, arriving at 10 a.m. just as Abdu'l-Bahá was shaking Smiley's hand. Smiley responded,
"Why, this is just what I have been seeking for many years. We had a Persian rug just like this one, but it was burned in a fire and my wife has been broken-hearted. This will make her very happy."
Abdu'l-Bahá continued an exhausting schedule of meetings and presentations on the East Coast. In Boston, delegates from many organizations gathered at the railway station to greet him on May 22nd. He stayed at the Hotel Charlesgate. At the American Unitarian Association Conference at the Tremont Temple Baptist Church, 800 Unitarian ministers and nearly 2,000 others were assembled. Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts Robert Luce eloquently introduced Abdu'l-Bahá, and the audience gave him a prolonged standing ovation. He spoke about the progress and evolution of creation. The audience applauded joyfully. At Clark University in Worcester, more than 1,000 students, faculty, and others heard his address on the importance of science. At the Cambridge home of Alice Breed, a large group gathered to celebrate Abdu'l-Bahá's 68th birthday. Though not wanting attention himself, he agreed to light the first of 68 candles on the cake, decorated with the flags of the United States, Persia, and England. The Boston Herald noted,
"It was the wish of Abdu'l-Bahá to have a flag of every country on the cake, as he is universal and considers every country his own."
He also went to a banquet at the Brookline home of Joseph Huntington White and Ellen Danforth White. Their magnificent estate, surrounded by gardens, was situated on a hill overlooking a lake. A great number of visitors came to see him, and it is thought that he spoke from the platform of a small outdoor amphitheater. Mahmoud notes,
He was pleased with the meeting and the surroundings. Then he went to a meeting at another home where he conversed with a gathering of philosophers for more than 2 hours.
At the Huntington Chambers, the Baha'is held a large farewell gathering where he spoke on the signs of progress in the 20th century. On a later trip to Boston in August, Abdu'l-Bahá delivered 18 recorded talks and had private meetings with ministers, rabbis, and journalists. He spoke at the New Thought Forum about how people must strive to reform the world, and to 500 people at Franklin Square House on the great historical achievements of women. He noted,
"While this principle of equality is true, it is likewise true that woman must prove her capacity and aptitude, must show forth the evidences of equality."
He addressed 500 at the Theosophical Society on the oneness of religions and the need to balance material with spiritual civilization. In Milford, Pennsylvania, Abdu'l-Bahá was invited to the estate of Gifford Pinchot, noted conservationist and later governor of Pennsylvania, to address prominent statesmen and dignitaries. In response to a question about a future war in Europe, Abdu'l-Bahá predicted the breakup of empires. Abdu'l-Bahá traveled to Philadelphia on Saturday, June 8th, where he had a brief 45-hour stay. On Sunday, he spoke to a total of over 3,000 people at the Rittenhouse Hotel and 2 churches. At the Unitarian Church, he addressed how the realm of divinity is sanctified above human comprehension and explained that the latest divine messenger was Baha'u'llah, who proclaimed the oneness of God and the unity of the world of humanity. One aspect of this oneness, he said, was that men and women are equal and should have the same course of education. He also equated women's education to the cause of world peace.
Equality between men and women is conducive to the abolition of warfare.
Elsewhere, he proclaimed that woman
will be the greatest factor in establishing universal peace and international arbitration. Assuredly, woman will abolish warfare.
At the Baptist Temple, Pastor Dr. Russell Conwell, Civil War veteran, author, and founder of Temple University, invited him to address 2,500 people. There he spoke of 2 pathways in the world of humanity.
One the natural or materialistic, the other the religious or spiritual. The second pathway is conducive to the progress and uplift of the world. It is the source of human enlightenment, training, and ethical improvement. The magnet which attracts the love of God.
Years later, Dr. Conwell told Martha Root,
"The Baha'i movement is the biggest movement in the world today, and Abdu'l-Bahá is the peace prophet of this age."
At the home of Mary Revelle, a stalwart Philadelphia Baha'i, he stressed devotion to Baha'u'llah. A crowd accompanied him to the train station. Abdu'l-Bahá spent another 3.5 weeks in New York, giving 31 talks. On June 18th, Abdu'l-Bahá went to the McNutt residence in Brooklyn to participate in a moving picture. The cameraman took 5 different short films of him. Juliet Thompson visited Abdu'l-Bahá daily and often joined him and his party in their daily walk in Riverside Park. One day she was astonished to see Walter Hampton, a great American stage actor, being greeted by Abdu'l-Bahá.
I saw the master open his arms wide and clasp the young man to his breast. He had a remarkable face, very pure and serene. I had seen him in the theater, he on stage, playing the part of the servant, Christ, and he played it with such spiritual fervor that I prayed with all my heart that he might someday meet the master.
An accomplished painter, Juliet had had a childhood wish to paint the face of Christ. When Abdu'l-Bahá consented to sit for a portrait, he instructed her to paint his servitude to God. She begged him to pray for her, and he agreed, saying, "As you are doing this only for the sake of God, you will be inspired." On June 19th, during the fourth sitting for the portrait, Lua Getzinger came to watch. Abdu'l-Bahá napped briefly, then said Juliet,
Suddenly, with a great flash like lightning, he opened his eyes, and the room seemed to rock like a ship in a storm with the power released. The master was blazing. The veils of glory had shriveled away in that flame, and we were exposed to the glory itself. Never shall I forget that moment. The flashing eyes of Abdu'l-Bahá, the reverberations of his voice, the power that still rocked the room. God of lightning and thunder, I thought. I appoint you, Lua, the herald of the covenant, and I am the covenant appointed by Baha'u'llah. A great joy had lifted Lua up. Her eyes were full of light. "Oh, recreate me," she cried, "that I may do this work for thee." By now I was sobbing uncontrollably. "Don't cry, Juliet," said the master. "Through tears, you cannot see to paint." I tried hard to hold back my tears and to work, but painting that day was at an end for me.
In Fanwood, New Jersey at the end of May, Abdu'l-Bahá gave 3 talks despite great heat and humidity. In Montclair, he stayed 9 days, seeking respite from the city heat. There he had time to purchase groceries and cook. He strolled in parks and visited the Oriental art shop of Dekran Madris Bedekian, an Armenian, to see the merchandise and speak to the staff. Victoria Bedekian, the owner's wife, became a devoted Baha'i, known for her published drawings and commitment to child education. On June 29th, Abdu'l-Bahá left Montclair for West Englewood. Roy Wilhelm, a prominent Baha'i who drove Abdu'l-Bahá to various sites in his car, had organized a unity feast at his home, surrounded by an extensive lawn and pine grove. Abdu'l-Bahá explained the event's purpose.
This is a delightful gathering. You have come here with sincere intentions. It is certain that this meeting will be productive of great results. This is a new day, and this hour is a new hour. Such gatherings as this have no equal or likeness in the world of mankind, for this meeting is a prototype of that inner and complete spiritual association in the eternal world. Hundreds of thousands of meetings shall be held to commemorate this occasion, and the very words I speak to you today shall be repeated in them for ages to come. You must become of one heart, one spirit, and one susceptibility. May you become as the waves of one sea, stars of the same heaven, fruits adorning the same tree, roses of one garden, that through you the oneness of humanity may establish its temple in the world. For you are the ones who are called to uplift the cause of unity among the nations of the earth.
The almost 250 present, Christians, Jews, Muslims, white and black, sat in a large circle of tables under the pine trees. Just before the food was served, Juliet Thompson recalled,
"A storm blew up, a strange sudden storm without warning. There was a tremendous crash of thunder. Big drops splashed on the tables. The master rose calmly and walked out to the road. I saw him lift his face to the sky. Then came a strong rushing. The clouds began to race away. Blue patches appeared and the sun shone out. And then the master walked back into the grove. This I witnessed."
After the dinner, Abdu'l-Bahá walked through the crowd and anointed everyone on the forehead with attar of rose. The crowd lingered. He spoke twice more, the last time under the moonlight. Abdu'l-Bahá stayed at Roy Wilhelm's home. Then visited the Morristown residence of Persia's Consul General Tophakian. In New York, crowds gathered to hear his daily talks. Ellen Tuller Beecher took her 13-year-old granddaughter, Dorothy Beecher, to meet Abdu'l-Bahá at one of the talks. The girl was terrified at first, but after he gestured for her to sit at a footstool at his feet, she couldn't remove her gaze from his face. He told her grandmother, "Your grandchild is my own daughter. You must train her for me." Dorothy Beecher Baker grew up to be an eloquent and dedicated Baha'i teacher. On July 9th, Abdu'l-Bahá asked Juliet Thompson to take him to the Museum of Natural History, where he seemed more interested in talking outside to an elderly museum guard than in seeing the museum's artifacts. When the man asked if he wanted to see more of the museum, Abdu'l-Bahá said he was tired of this world and more interested in things of the spiritual world. The old man responded with a preference for the material world, as it is something known. "But you do not lose it when you have attained the spiritual world," said Abdu'l-Bahá. "When you go upstairs in a house, you don't leave the house. The lower floor is under you." "Oh, I see," cried the guard, his whole face lighting up. Juliet asks,
Why had the master visited a museum of natural history in the hottest hour of a blistering July day? Had he instead visited a soul whose need was crying out to him to open an old man's eyes so that he might see to climb the stairs, to take away the dread of death?
On July 25th, Abdu'l-Bahá arrived at Agnes Parsons' Dublin, New Hampshire estate. During 3 weeks there, he gave private and small group talks and wrote letters to send all over the world. There he was able to rest, walk in the woods, shop, and cook for his friends. Mr. Parsons had a carriage and took Abdu'l-Bahá for rides around beautiful Dublin Lake and through the countryside. Though he stayed with his entourage at the Parsons house Dayspring, he moved to the Dublin Inn for part of his time to get more rest. Visitors arrived from Portland, Oregon, Washington, D.C., Boston, Cambridge, New York, and New Jersey. Abdu'l-Bahá went to the Harrisville train station to greet them. W. Harmon, a leader of the Theosophists in Boston, visited.
As I look back upon that time, I see him in that most majestic and sublime attitude, with which those who are nearest to him are so often impressed. His almost supernatural power. One has to feel it and see it in order to understand the fullness and completeness of his majesty.
Abdu'l-Bahá toured a summer camp for boys in the nearby village of Chesham with Dr. Charles Hanford Henderson, the owner and director, who told Abdu'l-Bahá that his was the first summer camp in the United States. Abdu'l-Bahá spoke to the boys, and they performed gymnastics for him. Aware of class and race distinctions in Dublin, Abdu'l-Bahá arranged for African American servants to meet at the Parsons boathouse. 28 attended, and Abdu'l-Bahá addressed them on unity and amity between blacks and whites. Mahmoud noted,
He spoke of the approaching wedding of Miss Matthew, a white woman, and Mr. Gregory, a black man, which is to take place shortly. This meeting was full of joy.
Abdu'l-Bahá spoke at the Parsons home every afternoon to audiences as large as 75. Among those who met Abdu'l-Bahá in Dublin included artists Joseph Lyndon Smith, Abbott Thayer, and George DeForest Brush, who hosted Abdu'l-Bahá for lunch and later became a Baha'i. Others who met him included Franklin McVeigh, United States Secretary of the Treasury under President Taft, and Professor Raphael Pumpelly, an American geologist, explorer, and Harvard professor, whose home Abdu'l-Bahá visited. Pumpelly's daughter, photographer Elise Pumpelly Cabot, took the Dublin pictures of Abdu'l-Bahá. Abdu'l-Bahá's only public talk in Dublin was at the Unitarian Church, filled to its capacity of 300. Built in 1852, the church also served as the town meeting house. Abdu'l-Bahá paced back and forth on the platform as he spoke. Reverend Howard Colby Ives described his gestures.
Never a dogmatic downward stroke of the hand, never an upraised warning finger, never the assumption of teacher to the taught, but always the encouraging upward swing of hands as though he would actually lift us up with them. And his voice, like a resonant bell of finest timbre, never loud, but of such penetrating quality that the walls of the room seemed to vibrate with its music.
Agnes Parsons said,
The people were motionless. So great was the power of his word. I had never seen him look as he did, nor had I ever been so impressed.
Abdu'l-Bahā's 50-minute address focused on true education, spiritual power, and Baha'u'llah's teachings. He chanted a prayer. Mahmoud noted,
A wonderful spirit of humility seemed to permeate the building, and the voice of acceptance seemed to issue from all sides.
Before leaving Dublin, he attended a play, then called on various people to say goodbye. Agnes hosted a musical performance where he spoke about the spiritual power of music, and during the afternoon talk, there was standing room only. On his last evening in Dublin, at the Pumpelly home, a large group gathered for dinner. They exchanged funny stories. Abdu'l-Bahá told several, saying that such stories made the difficulties easier when his family was in prison.
Akka, the early days of the 20th century. Despite relative freedom, Abdu'l-Bahá continues to live in conditions of hardship and danger. He is especially grieved as it is a period of sustained and barbaric persecution of the Baha'is in Persia. Physical torture and moral persecution continue for those who embrace the new faith. Even some of his own family members plot against him. In the midst of this, he continues to plant trees that bear fruit, which he offers to his friends and enemies alike.
On August 17th, Abdu'l-Bahá arrived in Elliott, Maine, at Greenacre, a conference center founded by Sarah Farmer to bring together people of diverse backgrounds and points of view. Sarah was the daughter of electrical genius Moses Garish Farmer and humanitarian Hannah Shapley Farmer, who established a residence for poor women and their children. Their home had been a way station on the Underground Railroad, and they knew Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and other reformers. In 1893, at the World's Parliament of Religions, Sarah invited Swami Vivekananda and Dharmampala to speak at Greenacre, where social reformers, educators, artists, scientists, religious seekers, and philosophers met to share ideas. The following year, Sarah dedicated Greenacre to the ideals of peace and unity and had the first known peace flag raised. Greenacre emerged as a center, if not the very heart, of liberal religion in the United States. In 1900, Sarah met Abdu'l-Bahá in Akka and embraced his teachings. When Abdu'l-Bahá arrived, she had not visited Greenacre in 3 years, having been confined to a sanatorium in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. As Abdu'l-Bahá approached Greenacre by car, multicolored Japanese lanterns and 500 eager souls lined the road. He stayed in the Greenacre Inn, in a room on the 3rd floor. After a short rest, he gave a brief talk on the investigation of reality. He then went to see Sarah Farmer in Portsmouth. According to Mahmoud,
when she saw Abdu'l-Bahá, she fell into such a state of rapture that every heart was moved.
During his week there, Abdu'l-Bahá brought Sarah Farmer to Greenacre and took her to see historic sites. A rare photograph was taken of Abdu'l-Bahá kissing Sarah Farmer's cheek in the motor car. Margaret Klebs recalled,
"The beloved one held her in his arms, driving slowly around the Greenacre fields. Blessed are we who could witness it."
Every evening, Abdu'l-Bahá spoke to several hundred on the oneness of humanity, the need for world peace, and the role of love. Mahmoud reported that Abdu'l-Bahá's eloquence produced
a wonderful impression on the whole audience. Fortune tellers, spiritualists, and ascetics came here to spread their superstitious views. The discourse of Abdu'l-Bahá completely swept away the cobwebs of superstitions. Some impostors came to see him, bowing and repenting.
Fred Mortensen of Minneapolis, formerly a petty criminal and a fugitive from justice, had been introduced to the Baha'i faith by his attorney, Albert Hall. When he learned that Abdu'l-Bahá was at Greenacre, Fred decided that he needed to meet him. As he had no money, he jumped a freight train, riding on top of and underneath trains until he arrived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He reached Greenacre head to foot covered with soot.
Arriving there, I found quite a number of people on the same mission, to see Abdu'l-Bahá. I was looking around when someone exclaimed, "Here he comes now!" After greeting others and when about to go to his room, Abdu'l-Bahá suddenly turned to me and said, "Sit down." I meekly obeyed. It seemed but a minute until Ahmad came down and said, "Abdu'l-Bahá wishes to see Mr. Mortensen." I nearly wilted. I hadn't expected to be called until the very last thing.
Fred entered the master's room. The two men exchanged greetings through an interpreter.
He welcomed me with a smile and a warm hand clasp. His first words were, "Welcome, welcome. You are very welcome. Then, are you happy?" And then he asked, Did you have a pleasant journey? Of all the questions I wished to avoid, this was the one. I lifted my eyes to his, and his were as two sparkling jewels, which seemed to look into my very depths, and a wondrous light seemed to pour out. It was the light of love, and I felt relieved and very much happier. I explained to him how I rode on the trains, after which he kissed both my cheeks, gave me fruit, and kissed the dirty hat I wore.
Abdu'l-Bahá said, "You are my guest." At a special dinner, he seated Fred at his right, ignoring the convention of social class. Abdu'l-Bahá delighted others at Greenacre. Ahmad Sohrab noted,
His majestic figure became familiar, greeting everyone, whether friend or stranger, young or old, in English. How are you? Are you well? Are you happy? Are you very happy? When the answer was given, he said in good English, Very well? Very happy? All right. And then the party addressed laughed because he laughed.
On August 19th, Abdu'l-Bahá spoke to around 300 people in a grove called the Pines, where Baha'is and others had delivered talks. He hosted 500 at a unity feast, where, speaking from the Staples House porch, his melodious voice prompted people passing by to stop and listen. He went with the crowd up to the hill of Montsalvat. There, Mahmoud noted,
He addressed this gathering on the necessity of founding the school for the investigation of religions which Miss Farmer wished to establish on that mountain. A picture was taken. It was an auspicious day.
On August 23rd, Abdu'l-Bahá said,
We have finished our work here. We have sown a seed.
The suitcases were packed and the carriage readied. As they lined both sides of the road to say farewell, people lamented and wept. When Abdu'l-Bahá prepared to step into the car, he spotted Fred Mortensen.
To my astonishment, he ordered me to get into the automobile.
Mortensen accompanied Abdu'l-Bahá for the next week in Malden, Massachusetts. On the way, Abdu'l-Bahá stopped for one last visit with Sarah Farmer, who fell at his feet weeping. In Malden, Abdu'l-Bahá stayed at a house owned by Mariah Wilson, where he gave talks, wrote numerous letters, and received many visitors. A close friend of Sarah Farmer's, Mariah had accompanied her on her trip to Egypt and Akka, and had returned for a second pilgrimage. Mariah had asked Abdu'l-Bahá to visit her if he came to America, as she wished to return his hospitality. She was overjoyed that he remembered and that she could host the 9 men in his entourage in her small home. From Malden, Abdu'l-Bahá took day trips to Boston to give talks. One day he went for an automobile ride along the Atlantic coast and enjoyed its beauty. On his last full day in Malden, so many wanted to see him that his hostess asked her friend, Madame Murray, a well-known pianist, to hold a meeting in her large home nearby. The program began with music. Abdu'l-Bahá spoke about the religions of the world to the nearly 100 present. One of the visitors at the Wilson home was Harry Randall, a skeptical Boston businessman who earlier had been surprised by his own response to meeting Abdu'l-Bahá.
He spoke in Persian, and my mind heard in English. Great is the power of the intellect, but it is dead without love. It needs the vivifying fragrance of love to make it a servant of God. He then blessed me and said, Be happy.
Now Randall had come to Malden at the urging of his wife, Ruth, who was dying of tuberculosis. He entered the house hoping he would be able to ask Abdu'l-Bahá to visit her, but it was crowded with people, and he was told Abdu'l-Bahá had at least 100 requests for appointments that afternoon. Randall realized it was hopeless to wait and felt annoyed because he knew Abdu'l-Bahá didn't even know he was there. Then suddenly the kitchen door opened and a voice called, "Abdu'l-Bahá will see Mr. Randall." Overcome, he went to the porch where Abdu'l-Bahá sat. When he looked up, Randall asked, "I wanted to know if you—" But that was as far as he got. Abdu'l-Bahá said, "Yes, I will come and see your wife this afternoon." Abdu'l-Bahā's visit to the Randall house was a turning point for Ruth, who recovered. The Randalls later lived in Haifa in service to the faith and to Abdu'l-Bahá. On August 30th, Abdu'l-Bahá left for Montreal, taking 2 members of his entourage. They were met at the train station by William Sutherland Maxwell, who took them to his home, where a group of friends and John Lewis, editor of the Montreal Daily Star, were waiting to see Abdu'l-Bahá. The first Baha'i group in Montreal had been formed by May and Sutherland Maxwell in 1902. May, whom Abdu'l-Bahá called a pearl and illumined, was the primary catalyst for his visit to Montreal. William Sutherland Maxwell was an architect who later designed the Shrine of the Bab, the golden domed monument on the side of Mount Carmel that became a focal point of the Baha'i World Center. The Maxwell home was later designated a Baha'i shrine, the only one in the Western Hemisphere. The Maxwells' 2-year-old daughter Mary remembered being so attracted to Abdu'l-Bahá that it was hard to keep away from him. Mary was to become the wife of Abdu'l-Bahā's grandson Shoghi Effendi 25 years later. In Montreal for 9 days, Abdu'l-Bahá continued his tireless public talks and meetings with individuals. He clearly enunciated the Baha'i principles and gave warnings about the urgent need for peace, especially in Europe, which he said was a storehouse of explosives awaiting a spark.
There is no greater or more woeful ordeal in the world of humanity today than impending war. Therefore, international peace is a crucial necessity. An arbitral court of justice shall be established by which international disputes are to be settled. Through this means, all possibility of discord and war between the nations will be obviated.
His addresses at the Church of the Messiah, St. James Methodist Church, the Socialist Club, the trades union headquarters, and at the Maxwell's home attracted widespread attention from the press and public. He spoke on economic justice, world peace, and social cohesion. At the Unitarian Church, according to Mahmoud, the pastor
read verses from the book of Isaiah which allude to the appearance of a promised one from the east. Everyone listened with rapt attention and felt that they had been specifically written for this day. The master's address was so enthusiastically received that it is difficult to describe, especially the effect of the prayer he chanted.
Prominent people who met Abdu'l-Bahá in Montreal included Archbishop Louis-Joseph Bruchesi, Principal of McGill University Sir William Peterson, Anglican Vicar Herbert Simmons, and Judge Robert Stanley Weir, famous for writing the English lyrics to O Canada. More publicity was generated in Montreal than in any other location on his journey. Many of the newspaper accounts in English, French, and Yiddish are full of reverence and praise. Of everyone, even journalists, he asked support. A writer for the Toronto Star Weekly wrote,
"He took my hand in both of his and blessed me as a father would bless a son. I cannot succeed," were his parting words, "without your help and the help of everyone who believes in the cause of universal peace and good fellowship among men. and that you may not forget me, I will ask you to accept a little gift from me." So saying, he handed me a small parcel with a handsome gold ring. It fit perfectly.
One day, Abdu'l-Bahá and his companions took a cable car up a mountain, which provided a magnificent sight of Montreal. Mahmoud writes,
"While we were here, accounts of the meetings in the newspapers were read to him. Suddenly he cried out, 'O Baha'u'llah, what a wonderful cause thou hast founded. It satisfies every assemblage. In the churches it shakes the souls and inspires joy in the peace meetings. It is a miracle.' Later, at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Maxwell, letters from the East were given to him. Among them was a letter on the greatness and significance of the journey of the Master, who said,
'Yes, the value and greatness of these travels are not known now, but will be apparent later on.'
On September 9th, Abdu'l-Bahá set out on a long journey to the West Coast. In Toronto, he stepped off the train and paced the platform. Exhausted, he wondered if he could make it to California. But he continued on. In Buffalo, he went to view the great beauty of Niagara Falls before addressing 70 people at the Hotel Iroquois. He garnered much media and public attention in Buffalo. In fact, when he gave money to the poor on the street, a crowd surrounded him, recognizing him from publicity. When he spoke at the Universalist Church of the Messiah, the congregation kept him up late asking questions. On September 12th, Abdu'l-Bahá was greeted at the Chicago train station by a large crowd who formed two lines. Abdu'l-Bahá walked majestically between them, showering his blessings on each one. Soichiro Fujita, a Japanese Baha'i, had climbed a lamppost for a better view. He was called down to Abdu'l-Bahā's side and invited to ride with him to Corinne True's home. He later journeyed with Abdu'l-Bahá to California. On September 15th, when Abdu'l-Bahá and his companions took an excursion to Kenosha, Wisconsin, they missed their train. Abdu'l-Bahá said there was a wisdom in this. Later, they came upon the wreckage of the train they had missed, which had collided with another. In Kenosha, Abdu'l-Bahá spoke at a congregational church and at a luncheon where people sang songs of praise and brought their children to him to be blessed. Next day in Chicago, he boarded a westbound train to Minneapolis and St. Paul. Abdu'l-Bahá gave talks at the Plaza Hotel and addressed the Saratov Temple about the truth of Jesus Christ and Muhammad. At the Commercial Club, he spoke on criteria for investigating truth. At Albert Hall's home, he spoke about ideal virtues. And at Dr. Clement Wilson's in St. Paul on spiritual education. On the drive from Minneapolis to St. Paul, he praised the beauty of the Mississippi River and the green landscape. About 1,000 people heard him speak in the Twin Cities over the 2 full days. He toured the Walker Art Gallery with Mrs. Willis Walker and took a walk at Loring Park before leaving for Nebraska. On September 21st, Abdu'l-Bahá boarded a train to Omaha. Though there were no Baha'is there, he gave a talk to a small gathering and spoke to reporters about how a European war could be avoided. In Lincoln, 2 newspaper reporters interviewed him. He wanted to visit William Jennings Bryan, who had visited him in 1906. But Bryan was on the road campaigning for Woodrow Wilson, so his family entertained Abdu'l-Bahá at their estate. He visited Bryan's library and wrote a prayer for the occasion. That night at his hotel, people who had read newspaper reports approached and asked questions. On trains, people often gathered around Abdu'l-Bahá to discover who he was and listen to his discourse. Once, when someone asked about the purpose of his trip, he said,
I have come to America to raise the standard of universal peace and the unity of mankind. My aim is to create love and harmony among the religions.
They arrived in Denver on September 24th, and Abdu'l-Bahá went to rest at the Shirley Hotel before his first talk at the home of Eudora Roberts, where a large crowd gathered. Nona L. Brooks, the pastor of the Church of Divine Science, invited him to speak at her church the next day. He also went to the home of Josephine Hall Clark, a widow who had lost one child and was raising her young son on her own. After becoming a Baha'i around 1896, she had longed for Abdu'l-Bahá to come to her modest home.
I had frequently dreamt that my home would become honored with the footsteps of the beloved Master.
A school teacher, Josephine had rushed off that morning without doing her dishes, intending to wash them before she met Abdu'l-Bahā's afternoon train. Detained at school, she found him on her front porch. She invited him in, worrying about the dishes. She motioned for him to sit, but instead he walked toward the kitchen, saying Abdu'l-Bahá would like a drink of water. He helped himself at the water pump and, returning, laughed as if to tell her she could hide nothing from him. He spoke and answered questions, then blessed the house. Today, the Clark House is designated an historic Baha'i property. Next morning, a rush of visitors came. Professors, clergymen, and philosophers. Newspapers published his picture and articles about his talks. At the Church of Divine Science that evening, Pastor Brooks came through the crowd to lead him to the pulpit. Afterwards, many people surrounded him and shook his hand. To one who visited him at the hotel, he extended an invitation.
I have come to your city and found tall buildings and advancement in material civilization. Now I will lead you to my own city. Its administration is the oneness of humanity. Its law is international peace. That is our city, and the founder is Baha'u'llah.
Of this visit to Denver, during which he spoke at least 5 times to perhaps 1,000 people, with at least 8 local newspaper articles appearing, reporter Frances Wayne in the Denver Post wrote,
Certainly Denver has not in the past been honored by the presence of a godlier man than this simple-hearted Persian whose only weapon is the word.
Abdu'l-Bahā's last day in Denver included private meetings, a walk around downtown, and a talk at the Shirley Hotel. On September 26th, he left for Salt Lake City and San Francisco. As the Rockies were too high to pass, the train went south to Pueblo, through the Royal Gorge, then to Leadville, then westward along the Colorado River. At Glenwood Springs, they got off. and he rested at the Hotel Colorado, a famous resort with adjacent hot springs. There they bathed in the natural springs at the Yampa Vapor Caves, which relieved Abdu'l-Bahá of his fatigue. He said,
"We have been to many lovely places during this journey, but because of our work we had no time to look at the scenery. Today, however, we have had a little respite."
They also enjoyed strolling in the hotel garden with its lovely fish pond. Abdu'l-Bahá indicated to his companions that he would like to have lunch outside. The manager, without being asked, ordered the waiters to set up tables and serve lunch to them in the garden. Guests approached who recognized him from Denver newspapers. Others watched from their rooms and balconies. When he boarded the train at midnight, he felt much better because of the respite. The journey continued through Salt Lake City, but the state fair was in full swing, along with the conventions of the Mormon Church and the National Irrigation Congress. Utah had no Baha'is, but Feeney Paulson from Montana came to meet Abdu'l-Bahá at the station. A reporter who met him at the Kenyon Hotel wrote an article in the Salt Lake City Tribune. The next day, Abdu'l-Bahá sat on the speaker's platform of the National Irrigation Congress. At the state fair, he purchased seeds to take back to the Holy Land. Feeney Paulson describes him at the state fair as a flowing-robed figure with majestic bearing, followed by his Oriental companions. The next morning, she left her modest accommodations at the YWCA to have tea with him at his hotel. She writes,
"The master served tea, saying, 'This is the Lord's Supper you are having with me.' He also said, 'I am your father.' That was to take the place of the father I had never remembered, and whom I had so often tried to recall. He gave me a locket-sized likeness of himself, as a father gives a treasure to one of his children. Although the details of each person in the presence of Abdu'l-Bahá are different, they are the means to the same end, spiritual progress. Incidents forgotten and hidden in the recesses of one's being, in his presence, are in a flash perceived and unobtrusively aired. Problems and burdens become non-essentials in the light of his divine love. Abdu'l-Bahá was the supreme psychiatrist."
Abdu'l-Bahá then embarked on the last stage of his journey west, traveling on the Central Pacific Railroad through Reno to San Francisco. While traversing the Sierra Nevada, he made a reference to the snow sheds at Donner Pass and the struggle of its pioneering members. Baha'is had also pioneered west after a letter came from Abdu'l-Bahá saying he hoped that there would be a Baha'i in every state when he came to the United States. John Wilcott had moved from Kenosha to Kendall, Montana with his elderly mother. who was also a Baha'i. John wrote detailed reports of his experiences to individuals and to the Baha'i newsletter.
Dear servants of Abdu'l-Bahá, I know you will be pleased to hear from this part of the West. Although the work of giving the message is rather slow, we allow no opportunity to pass. Mother and I are the only Baha'is around here, and up to this time we have had only cowboys, shepherds, and ranchers to talk to, who live many miles apart. Some come to the tent daily, and I am now called the preacher for miles around. At first, some of them did not want to hear anything of God, but after some great hidden mysteries were explained to them, they became interested. And you would be surprised to see us sitting on a log outside or in a tent until 10 o'clock at night. This country is wild with rattlesnakes and wolves. I have killed many snakes. One was in our tent last night. We heard him rattle. We dare not sleep with an arm outside the bed. Here comes another old shepherd who likes to come here, so I must stop writing. Your servant in his name, John H. Wilcott.
While there is no record of John's having met Abdu'l-Bahá, there are many stories of early Baha'is who bravely took Abdu'l-Bahā's admonitions and encouragement to heart and changed their lives accordingly. During Abdu'l-Bahā's 24 days in California, he presented his message to more than 10,000 people at colleges, churches, and homes. The Baha'is flocked to see him, and their enthusiasm, their excitement and joy and singing surrounded him. He told them,
"Your love drew me to you."
A house was rented for him in San Francisco, where large rooms on the first floor remained crowded during his stay, and upstairs he held private interviews. Helen Goodall and her daughter Ella Cooper were among the vibrant Baha'i teachers. Their home in Oakland was a center of activity. Abdu'l-Bahá was especially delighted to meet Japanese friends in California, calling one such meeting an historic event. Kenichi Yamamoto, the first Japanese Baha'i, and Mrs. Goodall's butler, arranged for Abdu'l-Bahá to address the Japanese YMCA in Oakland. After that, Japanese inquirers were present in almost every gathering. Abdu'l-Bahá was greatly pleased with San Francisco and particularly enjoyed his visits to Golden Gate Park. He took special interest in the flowers and wildlife and often walked along the park's small lakes. After an afternoon visit to Lloyd Lake, he reported,
"We are in utmost joy among the friends of San Francisco. The confirmations are really overwhelming and the happiness overflowing."
When he saw the remains of the marble pillars left by the 1906 earthquake, he said,
"The world and its condition will change to such a degree that nothing but a remnant, like these pillars, will remain of the previous order."
On October 6th, he addressed the congregation of the First Unitarian Church, who stood respectfully as soon as he entered the church. The pastor introduced him with a statement about his life and teachings and a scriptural passage from the writings of Baha'u'llah. After his talk, he chanted an inspiring prayer. The pastor thanked him, and a crowd of people gathered around him to shake his hand. The next day, the San Francisco Examiner reported on the service.
The venerable leader of the faith, which now numbers more than 3 million followers, looked like a patriarch of old as he stood in the pulpit and addressed the multitude in the church on peace and love for all mankind.
Helen Goodall hosted several events. On Children's Day, the parlors were filled with children, adults, and fragrant flowers. The children sang for him, and he called them to him to give out candy, flowers, and envelopes with rose petals. Before his departure, a memorable feast was held in the Goodall home. According to Frances Orr Allen,
the beautiful rooms were filled with tables adorned with yellow chrysanthemums and pyramids of fruit. There were 110 present, from the Bay Cities and also from Portland and Seattle. When all were seated at table, Abdu'l-Bahá requested that we partake of the food so bountifully provided, while he walked about speaking words of wisdom and love, giving us the spiritual food for which we hungered. Gathered under one roof were people of various nationalities, the young and old, meeting in love and fellowship, in devotion to the servant of God. Then from the stairs, he pronounced a benediction upon all.
David Starr Jordan, the president of Leland Stanford University, came to see Abdu'l-Bahá, inviting him to speak at Stanford. On October 8th, Abdu'l-Bahá took the train to Menlo Park near Palo Alto, then rode by carriage to Stanford University, where he gave a stirring address to around 2,000 people, including students, teaching staff, administrators, civic leaders, and prominent people. Scholar H.M. Balyuzi describes the speech as one of the most powerful of his ministry.
God created one earth and one mankind to people it. Man has no other habitation, but man himself has come forth and proclaimed imaginary boundary lines and territorial restrictions. We live upon this earth for a few days and then rest beneath it forever. So it is our graveyard eternally. Shall man fight for the tomb which devours him, for his eternal sepulchre? What ignorance could be greater than this? It is my hope that you, who are students in this university, may never be called upon to fight for the dust of earth, which is the tomb and sepulchre of all mankind.
When Abdu'l-Bahá had finished speaking, the thunderous applause and expressions of enthusiasm were striking. President Jordan gave Abdu'l-Bahá a tour of the campus and then hosted a luncheon at his residence. Lua Getzinger, writing a letter to Agnes Parsons that day, recounted,
"My dearest Agnes, we have had the most wonderful day with Abdu'l-Bahá here. This morning he spoke to 1,500 students. His subject was international peace, and such splendid attention was paid him. When he finished, they cheered and cheered until he arose, and then the whole audience rose. And the students gave the college yell. It was perfectly splendid. Your devoted Lua."
An entire edition of the Palo Altan was devoted to articles concerning Abdu'l-Bahá's visit, with transcriptions of his talks on peace and unity.
Those who pray for the kingdom of God on earth may see in Abbas Effendi one who dwells in that kingdom consciously and creates an environment pulsating with a peace that passeth ordinary understanding.
At the University of California at Berkeley, he enjoyed visiting the Greek theater. Everywhere he went, people were drawn to him and inquired about him. Ramona Allen Brown tried to describe him, but she says,
"How can anyone describe him? Each one of us saw him with our own spiritual and physical eyes. In the Master's presence, I felt as though I were in another world. Despite his advanced age and the vicissitudes he'd endured, his carriage was majestic and his posture remarkable. He was strong and vibrant. When his face was in repose, his eyes looked sad and showed the suffering he'd endured. However, when Abdu'l-Bahá smiled, the sadness vanished, and one saw only glorious beauty. He loved the sound of laughter and often told stories and anecdotes to make us laugh."
In San Francisco, Abdu'l-Bahá spoke at the Open Forum, where his discourse was scientific. He also spoke before the Theosophical Society, in the Reading Room of the Blind, and to a group of physicians on the use of diet to cure diseases. Abdu'l-Bahá addressed the Century Club on equality between men and women. He spoke of women's superiority in kindness and tenderness, and in valor and courage. Abdu'l-Bahá spoke at the First Congregational Church of Oakland. He also spoke to a large gathering at a high school in Berkeley. On October 12th, Abdu'l-Bahá, introduced by Rabbi Martin Meyer, delivered an address at Temple Emmanuel, to a Jewish congregation of some 2,000 people. Francis Orr Allen reported,
"It was a wonderful sight. Abdu'l-Bahá standing in the pulpit of that magnificent synagogue, he proved to the congregation the validity of Christ. He urged them to respect the name of Christ and of Muhammad."
Willard Hatch, sitting in the balcony, also described it.
The scene was dramatic. Abdu'l-Bahá showed that the Prophet Muhammad was the upholder of Moses and Christ, that to be unprejudiced promotes the welfare of mankind.
Mahmoud called the talk a miracle, and also noted that afterwards there was unity and communication between Jews and Christians. One morning, Abdu'l-Bahá visited the humble home of Charles Tinsley, an African-American man confined to his bed with a broken leg. Abdu'l-Bahá told him a story of a ruler who trained the subject he loved best by causing him sorrow and suffering, that he might be fit for the great place the ruler had destined him to fill. He added,
"Even so with you. After this ordeal, you will soon recover and be spiritually stronger than ever before. You will work for God and carry the message to many of your people."
He never forgot that visit with Abdu'l-Bahá. On October 14th, Abdu'l-Bahá began a 2-day stay at Phoebe Hearst's estate in Pleasanton, the hacienda. He spoke informally several times to Hearst's guests, some of the elite of California society, and also took walks through the gardens and rides through the countryside. There, with an American presidential election imminent, Abdu'l-Bahá described the sort of person who should be elected to the presidency.
The president must be a man who does not insistently seek the presidency. He should be a person free from all thoughts of name and rank. Rather, he should say, "I am unworthy and incapable of this position, and cannot bear this great burden." The president must be a well-wisher of all, and not a self-seeking person.
In Washington, D.C., he had also touched on the topic, asking Florence Kahn, "What would you say if a woman were to become president of the United States?" Abdu'l-Bahá then said,
"The time will come when the presidency will go begging. So advanced will civilization have become that no one will want to leave his social and humanitarian tasks to take the time to assume the presidency."
On his last day at the hacienda, Abdu'l-Bahá asked to meet with the servants. To the astonishment of Hearst's guests, he spoke to the servants and gave each a generous tip. Robert Turner, the first African-American Baha'i and the butler of Phoebe Hearst, had met Abdu'l-Bahá in the Holy Land in 1898, where Abdu'l-Bahá greeted him with joy. Near Santa Cruz, Abdu'l-Bahá met with John and Louise Bosch, whose home a decade later would become a Baha'i school. On October 18th, Abdu'l-Bahá made a special trip south to Los Angeles to visit the grave of Thornton Chase, the first American Baha'i. He had died several weeks earlier. The next morning, he went with a group of Baha'is to the cemetery and walked directly to the gravesite without being told its location, covered it with flowers and chanted Baha'i prayers. Then he knelt on the ground and kissed the tombstone. Harriet Klein was present.
As Abdu'l-Bahá knelt and kissed the soil which covered all that was mortal about Thornton Chase, I felt he had made holy all the soil of my native state.
Abdu'l-Bahá told those gathered that future years would reveal the stature of Thornton Chase, and they should visit his grave every year. During his remaining stay in Los Angeles at the Hotel Lancashire, people and the press continued to seek him out. Visiting Pasadena, he enjoyed the serenity and beauty of Busch Gardens. Back in Oakland, a farewell meeting was held at the Goodall home. Ramona Allen Brown describes how, during his final address, his eyes became luminous, and with great authority, he spelled out his relationship to Baha'u'llah as the center of his covenant. His last stop in California was Sacramento. In a talk at the Hotel Sacramento, he condemned the violence in the Balkans and warned that Europe was a powder keg and a much greater and more destructive war was inevitable. Then he affirmed,
"May the first flag of international peace be upraised in this state."
Decades later, in 1945, the United Nations flag was hoisted for the first time in San Francisco. Abdu'l-Bahá left California on October 26th. His work in America, he said, was accomplished. When Abdu'l-Bahá left California, only 40 days remained of his North American travels. During the next 2 weeks, he traveled over 3,000 miles by train, stopping in 5 cities before returning to New York. His days on the train were eventful. Travelers recognized him from publicity, as did crew members from his earlier journeys. People sought his company, and he spoke to small groups about spiritual matters. When he arrived again in Denver on October 29th, friends and reporters thronged to the Oxford Hotel. The next day he spoke at the Roberts home and at the Universalist Church. The train reached Chicago on October 31st. Abdu'l-Bahá gave 3 public talks in Chicago over 5 days. He spoke of the greatness of the age and of the oneness of humanity. Rabindranath Tagore, who in 1913 became the first non-European to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, met Abdu'l-Bahá in Chicago. Years later, Tagore expressed deep love and appreciation for him. Abdu'l-Bahá also spoke at Corinne True's house, where he described his happiness in seeing the Chicago Baha'is again.
My third visit here expresses the degree of my longing to see you and the extent of my love. I hope that these visits may be productive of future results.
Describing a gathering at the home of Beatrice Davies, Mahmoud notes,
"It is not possible to describe the impact on the minds, the exhilaration of the spirits, and the delight of the soul. When his automobile left, everyone wept and expressed their sorrow at their separation from their beloved.
In Cincinnati, Abdu'l-Bahá spoke to over 500 people at the Grand Hotel. Then at a banquet for him, his entourage, and the Cincinnati Baha'is. He had informal conversations late into the night, and 40 local Baha'is stayed at the hotel to be near him. The next morning, he spoke to them about the future Universal House of Justice, and in a public talk called America to be the standard bearer of peace throughout the world. The next day, November 6th, the Cincinnati Enquirer reported that Dr. Bahá had spoken, and also that Woodrow Wilson had been elected president. In Washington, D.C., for 5 days, he gave at least 13 talks to large groups and met with small groups and individuals. He spoke at the Universalist Church and at the 8th Street Temple Synagogue, where the mention of Christ created a stir. Agnes Parsons described the atmosphere as electrical. On November 9th, the Baha'is held a banquet at Rauscher's Hall where diverse races could attend. Abdu'l-Bahá walked among the 300 present, anointing them with attar of rose and distributing candy and flowers. Abdu'l-Bahá traveled to Baltimore on November 11th, arriving at Camden Station. Then went to the fashionable Hotel Rennert, where he met the press and rested. He spoke at the Unitarian Church to Johns Hopkins professors, business and professional men, and Baha'is on the unity of religions. The Baltimore Sun illustrated the impressive manner of his delivery, his voice low and rising for emphasis, his pauses for the interpreter, and his gestures that demonstrated universalism. He declared that the nations looked to America as the leader of a world movement. He had lunch with around 55 people at the home of Howard and Hebe Struven. Afterwards, with arms outstretched, he declared,
"Many friends have I in Baltimore."
At 3, he left Baltimore with his entourage. He wired the friends in Philadelphia to meet him at the station. On the platform, they rushed to him joyfully, and some rode to the next stop with him, stirring great curiosity. In New York, a great rush of visitors came to see him, and when he was too tired, he would go alone to the gardens at Riverside Park. Though invited to the homes of socially prominent New Yorkers, Abdu'l-Bahá preferred to visit the poor. He did, however, visit Andrew Carnegie in his home. And on November 19th, the New York Times reported that Abdu'l-Bahá visited the library of financier J.P. Morgan. And wrote a blessing in his album.
O thou generous Lord, verily this famous personage has done considerable philanthropy. Render him great and dear in thy kingdom. Make him happy and joyous in both worlds. Confirm him in serving the oneness, the world of humanity, and submerge him in the sea of thy favors.
A farewell banquet was held on November 23rd at the Great Northern Hotel, attended by more than 300. The hall was regally decorated, the tables shone with crystal. But when the hotel proprietor realized that African Americans had been invited, he refused to allow them to come. Perhaps not wanting to disappoint all the other guests, Abdu'l-Bahá allowed the banquet to be held, but spoke passionately on the oneness of humanity. Abdu'l-Bahá arranged for a banquet for the African Americans the next night at the home of the Kennys. Many white women came forward to cook for and serve the guests, showering them with love. In 1912, this was an unusual occasion, held before the Harlem Renaissance and long before the Civil Rights Movement. Abdu'l-Bahá said,
"Behold what an influence and effect the words of Baha'u'llah have had upon the hearts, that hating and shunning have been forgotten, that prejudices have been obliterated to such an extent that you arose to serve one another with great sincerity."
Mahmoud notes,
"The Master's words made a great impression. The meeting demonstrated the power and influence of the cause in uniting in sincerity and love two races.
On December 2nd, he told a gathering,
"These are the days of my farewell to you. You must manifest complete love and affection toward all. Do not exalt yourselves above others, but consider all as your equals. Be filled with love for every race and be kind toward the people of all nationalities. Be as a lamp shining forth with the light of the virtues of the world of humanity."
On December 4th, his last night in America, he spoke to the Theosophical Society.
"I have received the greatest kindness from the American people. I look upon them as a noble nation, capable of every perfection. Now I bid farewell to you all, and I pray that you may attain the highest station of humanity. I shall never forget you. You shall always live in my thought."
On December 5th, after 239 days, Abdu'l-Bahá left America. The New York dock alongside the SS Celtic was crowded with people, many distressed and in tears. Some, like Juliet, were heartbroken.
It was death to leave that ship. I stood on the pier, tears blurring my sight. Through them, I could see the Master waving a patient hand to us. It waved and waved, that beautiful patient hand, till the figure was lost to sight.
For the next 6 months, he continued to travel, on to England, Scotland, and France, Germany, Austria, and Hungary, presenting the Baha'i message of universal peace and unity. His prediction that the European powder keg would explode soon came true. During this terrible war, he returned to Ottoman Palestine, a land torn by both famine and warfare. Once again, the Turks considered him a great danger, threatening him with crucifixion. Through it all, Abdu'l-Bahá continued his lifelong service. Having trained Baha'is in the Holy Land to raise and store grain in the pre-war years, he now used that grain to feed the hungry, including soldiers of all nationalities, and he oversaw medical stations. After the war, Abdu'l-Bahá was knighted by the British monarch for his famine relief efforts.
November 28th, 1921. Abdu'l-Bahá passes away. The Holy Land, often convulsed by religious conflict, witnesses an unprecedented event of unity and collective emotion. As Jews, Christians, Muslims, Baha'is, Arabs, Turks, Kurds, Armenians, and other ethnic groups, and prominent leaders from the nations around the world, over 10,000 in all, attend his funeral, peacefully grieving his death, but rejoicing in his life.
Abdu'l-Bahá proved unique in religious history. While some wanted to acclaim him as a prophet, Messiah, or messenger of God, and some described him as Christ-like or as a divine father, he himself declared that his station was that of servant, reflected in his very name, which means servant of glory. In time, his luminous journey will be more fully entwined with the history and destiny of North America.
This is a new cycle of human power. All the horizons of the world are luminous, and the world will become indeed as a garden and a paradise. It is the hour of unity and of the drawing together of all races and all classes. The gift of God to this enlightened age is the knowledge of the oneness of mankind and of the fundamental oneness of religion. War shall cease between nations, and the most great peace shall come. My name is Abdu'l-Bahá. My qualification is Abdu'l-Bahá. My reality is Abdu'l-Bahá. Servitude to all the human race, my perpetual religion. No name, no title, no mention, no commendation have I except Abdu'l-Bahá. This is my longing. This is my greatest yearning. This is my eternal life.
A fearless